Good morning. Well, I'm delighted to introduce Dermot Moran, who is Professor of Philosophy at University College Dublin. He works in several areas of philosophy, including, of course, Phenomenology, and he's published a number of very important books and articles. In fact, he's just finished a book on Husserl's last manuscript, Crisis of European Sciences, which will be published by CUP next year. And today he's going to convince David Papineau that phenomenology cannot be naturalized.
Yes, thank you very much, Matthew. And thank you to Javi and all the people at UE for inviting me and for having such a nice conference, actually. It's going very well, so I'm enjoying it. I was thinking of that phrase, let's look at it objectively. And I was thinking that sort of summarizes exactly the problem, how we, from our own subjective point of view, can adopt an objective point of view. And you know, any objective point of view that's arrived at has to be one constituted out of and from our subjective basis. And I take that to be really what transcendental idealism is trying to accomplish. Some way of building an account of an objective viewing that is related to our subjective viewing. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I wanted to get straight into what I take transcendental idealism to mean. And as Matthew said, I've been working on the crisis, so a lot of my quotations are taken from the crisis, which is Husserl's last work. Now, in the crisis, as you can see from this quotation, Husserl interprets his entire historical development in terms of transcendental phenomenology, claiming that he had made the first breakthrough to transcendental phenomenology already in the logical investigations. I don't know if there's no pointer on it. Whereas, in fact, the usual view, what I would call the English view of Husserl, which is sort of the Barry Smith, Peter Simons, and Kevin Mulligan view, is that Husserl was a logical sort of realist in the logical investigations, and then slipped back into being a transcendental idealist in his later career. Husserl himself thought that he had made the breakthrough to the transcendental idealist insight right at the beginning of his career, in 1898, as he says here, that the correlation between world and the subjective manners of givenness never evoked philosophical wonder, in spite of the fact that it had made itself felt even in pre-Socratic philosophy and among the sophists. That is, how the subject can arrive at objectivity, though here only as a motive for skeptical argumentation. This correlation never aroused philosophical interest of its own, which could have made it the object of an appropriate scientific attitude. A contemporary French philosopher, Quentin Meillassoux, talks about this as correlationism, and he thinks of this as coming from Kant. There's what I take to be a kind of summary claim of Husserl's regarding this correlationism, coming from his 1917 inaugural address to Freiburg University. To every object there corresponds an ideally closed system of truths that are true of it, and on the other hand an ideal system of possible cognitive processes by virtue of which the object and the truths about it would be given to any cognitive subject. So you have two sets of ideal truths. The possible ways the object can appear and the possible ways the subject can relate to the object. So I think that's what phenomenology is trying to track. And as I'll say more about as I get further into it, in transcendental idealism, it's not enough to say that there are a priori conditions, if you like, for the possibility of experience, but that these a priori conditions are somehow related to an ego. And that the ego is, if you like, the constituting source for all our experience. This is a very strong claim. Husserl makes it all through his career, but I suppose especially in the Cartesian Meditations, because Husserl thinks that Descartes, rather than Kant, is the founder of transcendental philosophy. But I'll say something about that. What's interesting here in this phrase, the ego constitutes himself for himself, so to speak, in the unity of a history, is related to what we were talking about, or what Rudolph was talking about yesterday, that experiences obviously build on experiences. And the way the human self evolves, in terms, I always think of it like a snowball. As it goes through life, it accumulates experiences that condition it and accrue to it as habitualities, or whatever, as Husserl would say, and makes it into the sort of self that it becomes. In other words, the history of it belongs to its own nature. And we have to think of that very peculiar kind of self-formation as a kind of clue to the notion of constitution of objects in general. For Husserl, he says there, the constitution of the ego contains all the constitutions of all the objectivities existing for him, whether immanent or transcendent, ideal or real. So nature, the cultural world, and so on, have a certain kind of content for me because of the manner in which I bring them into play. You know, I won't read the whole quotation. And correlating with the idea that there is a kind of subjective constitution of everything in the manner in which the subject constitutes itself, there is also the idea that the world is given to me in a certain kind of in a certain manner, which is not that of understanding an object, but as having a kind of horizontal consciousness. Husserl speaks about world consciousness, and Husserl criticizes Kant for thinking that we didn't have this experience of world consciousness. So Husserl says here, I'm continually conscious of individual things in the world as things that interest me, move me, and so on. But in doing so, I also have consciousness of the world itself as that in which I am, although it is not there as a thing, nor does it affect me as things do. If I were not conscious of the world as world, without it becoming capable of becoming objective in the manner of an object, how could I survey the world reflectively and put knowledge of the world into play, thus lifting myself above straightforward life? Okay, how is it that each of us constantly has world consciousness? And that becomes a very crucial part of the later phenomenology of Husserl, the sense that I have of not just being present before object, if you like, but of having an indefinite horizon, both in terms of the physical one and the mental one and the temporal one, and the sort of meaning horizons, which are there for me but not as objects. So it's I think of transcendental idealism as raising this issue of how I constitute everything in the world. I mean, right now I'm constituting everyone in this room as a human being, right? And different from the physical objects that they're sitting on and so on. That I'm doing a very rich and complex set of constitutional differentiations of things, and it's me who's doing it, and I can go wrong in doing it and so on, and I can have pathologies that prevent me doing it in a certain way. But there is way. I mean, I saw a program about people in Berlin who thought they were vampires, genuinely thought they were vampires, and one of them was being interviewed, and she was saying, well, when you are on the subway, you see people, I see lumps of meat. And I thought that was actually a very interesting constitutional attitude that the vampire takes, if you like. And that transcendental idealism, of course, has to set it resolutely, and has always set itself resolutely against naturalism. I think the letter was quoted yesterday, Husserl's letter to Rickert, that Husserl writes to Rickert to say that the neo-Kantians and the phenomenologists are in agreement against the common enemy of our time, which is naturalism. Roy Wood Sellers, I'm just giving it. Husserl's definition of naturalism is really a kind of physicalism, that the naturalist sees nothing but nature, and first of all, physical nature. He speaks at times of physicalistic naturalism. And it's interesting, he gives, especially in The Crisis, a historical account of the evolution of naturalism. And in his account of the evolution of modern philosophy, he thinks that, as he says here, what's significant is not the usual contrast between empiricism and rationalism, but that they both bought into a kind of naturalist physicalism. Right? This is true of the other sciences of the modern period. In The Crisis, Husserl here, by the way, is very interesting, comments that what he means by physicalism is a certain stance taken by people who interpret modern physics in a particular way. And interestingly, he excludes here the Vienna Circle logical positivists from being physicalists in the sense that he's talking about. I think he recognizes their more complex position, but that's another matter. Typically, Husserl thinks of naturalism as thinking of human beings as physical objects in space. and time. There's a typical quotation there. Looks at man as filled out extension, thus considers the world in general only as nature in the broader sense. The duration is taken to be objective duration, and so on. And the mind is thought of, while not exactly shaped like the body, but as a coexistence of psychic data, right? A streaming of psychic data. And this is what Husserl attributes to Locke. He thinks that the naturalistic physicalism of Hobbes, for example, gets construed in a psychological way by Locke, which thinks of the soul, as he says there, as something self-contained and real, as a body. It is taken as an isolated place, a writing tablet. He often uses that tabula rasa reference to say that that is how the psychic has been thought to be within naturalism. And now, I'll skip through this. He thinks of Hume not just as a great naturalist, but also as actually pushing naturalism to its conclusion and turning it into a transcendentalism. I'm going to skip beyond that because I don't have time. But he also thinks of Kant as a naturalist for various reasons that we can go into, but primarily, and he was criticizing various people in Kant's time or afterwards who interpreted Kant as thinking that the conditions of the possibility of experience were conditions that happened to be due to our human condition, what he calls anthropologism, the view that space and time and the conditions of causality and so on, the categories, they are our human way of knowing. The problem about that is it ends up as a kind of psychologism. Husserl had been saying this as early as the logical investigations. And Husserl himself pushes a view of Kant, which is probably closer to what we now have, that Kant is not talking just about the limits of human knowledge, but about the limits on any kind of knowledge at all. There's some argument about this, which has two sources, sensibility and understanding, something like that. But Husserl regards even his own teachers, Brentano, and especially the psychologists, Wundt and Brentano, he regards them as having great insights regarding intentionality, but misunderstanding what they thought about intentionality because they couldn't let go of this inner concept of the mind, tabula rasa concept of the mind as a stream of experiences, and so on. And they missed out on this understanding of intentionality. Brentano's discovery of intentionality never led him to see it as a complex of performances which include a sedimented history in the currently constituted intentional unity and its current manners of givenness. A history that one can always uncover following a strict method. That is that, according to Husserl, the real insight in Brentano's descriptive psychology was the manner of intentional constitution and modes of givenness that of things that we experience, which are layered in complex ways that can be uncovered. We can uncover these different layers of constitution according to a method. I'll skip beyond that. Husserl is very aware that the real danger is this naturalism that begins as physicalism. Then there is this sort of second element, which is the construal of the psychic in naturalistic terms and physicalistic terms, if not as physical, then as some kind of appendage to the physical. He talks about this in terms of modern science and the splitting off of subjective relative properties from primary properties and so on. And the whole science of psychology as being set up from what was left over from physics and the physical sciences. And that already made it compromised. But he thinks here that you have to overcome psychologism and objectivism, and especially what he calls this sensualism with regard to consciousness, the naturalization of consciousness. And this can't be done unless we really rethink the nature of consciousness. It can't be understood in any kind of sensualistic manner, as a simple stream of experiences. Husserl thinks that the problem, that what naturalism has done, it has falsely objectified and absolutized the world. This reification or Verdinglichung of the world and its absolutization. This is what's happened through naturalism. We think of the world as something that's there in itself, that is there prior to us being there, right? And that if we think of it very much in that naturalistic way, we miss it. We miss the sense of what we've done in terms of the constituting of the world. And this is a real key to the Husserl's later understanding of phenomenology, as trying to explore the manner in which human beings live in the life world and experience the world, that we have to recognize that our human experience of the world is not of the world of science. In ordinary life, we have nothing whatsoever to do with objects of nature, as understood in that sense of objects of natural science. What we take as things are pictures, statues, gardens, houses, tables, and so on, value objects, use objects. They are not the objects that can be found in natural science. I mean, this is the directly opposite view that Husserl takes to that of the Vienna Circle Manifesto, that what it proposed, what was called there the scientific conception of the world. Wissenschaftliche Weltauffassung. That the very title in the Vienna Circle Manifesto was a kind of attempt to get people to replace this conception of the world with the natural scientific conception of the world. We hear of it often in the limit of materialism, that we want to teach people not to say there's a rainbow, but there's light refracted at a 45-degree angle through moisture or whatever. And Husserl is making the point that we don't live in a world of science. We live in the life world, which has its own categorical structures. The bodies familiar to us in the life world are actual bodies, not bodies in the sense of physics. The same is true of causality and spatiotemporal infinity. These categorical features of the life world have the same names, but are not concerned, so to speak, with the theoretical idealizations and substructions of the geometer and the physicist. I think that's very important, that they have the same name. So we talk about time, and the physicist talks about time, and the physicist has mathematical equations for working out how time is to be represented within the mathematical physics. But our sense of time passing, and our sense of past and future and history, and the continuation of the past into the present and so on, that is what is involved in the life world. And in his late years, Husserl became very interested in the work of Lévi-Bruhl, who was trying to document the concepts of causation, spatiality, and temporality that, for example, primitive peoples had, on the grounds that he thought that there were kind of categorical frameworks that were structuring different peoples within the life world. And it is, if you like, kind of what Husserl is talking about here is what in the contemporary world people talk about in terms of things like folk physics. That people have a conception, Elizabeth Spelke is a psychologist who studies what children think about objects when you throw them. Do small children think that when you throw an object, the object distends or changes shape? Or do they think that they follow natural trajectories? It's kind of Aristotelian physics, if you like. It is a kind of natural, there is a sort of intuitive understanding of the causal interactions in the world that very small children have, and that evolve in various ways, and that can be trained and marshaled in various ways depending on scientific education and so on. But it is the way of the life world. And Husserl thinks that if phenomenology has to understand that first, because he thinks of naturalistic physics and as a construction based on that. And it's the forgottenness of that original life world that makes us think, as many people interpret Kant as saying, that, say, Newtonian framework of space and time is precisely that which is captured within our sensibility. So that's for Husserl a mistake. So there's a whole set of things that are wrong with naturalism according to Husserl, just summarizing what we've been saying somewhere in various parts along what we've said so far. It misunderstands the flow of conscious experiences, and especially what I just call here the non-real parts of those experiences. It's a really crucial part of Husserl's phenomenology all along, that you can parse lived experiences into their parts, but the parts constitute not just, if you like, the temporal material, if you could call it material parts of a thought, thinking that it's going to rain. Well, obviously, some representation of rain in some sense must be in that thought. But there's also the non-real parts of the thought. These are the universals that one sees when one thinks rain. You don't think this set of drops, but you think rain in general. So there's a kind of a non-real categorical framework of some kind that is nested on or built in some respect on the material part. And the psychology, he thinks, can't understand them, misunderstands them, hence psychologism. Nor can it understand, if you like, the retentions and protensions and other horizontal features of the experience that I was mentioning earlier on, that there is always an element of things that are not part of what we currently presented in front of us. There are, for example, in physical perception, there's always the other sides of the object we don't see, but which are given in some kind of co-intended empty presenting. So we don't know. I don't know actually what color the underside of the desk is. I can imagine it being the same color, or I can paint it in my imagination as a different color. But I present the underside of the desk as having an underside and having a color. And it's that kind of empty intending that belongs to the horizontal aspects of our experience that are real, in one sense of real, that are really present, but not, if you like, at the fore of our experience. The reification of the ego is a really crucial point in the slightly later Husserl, that he thinks that, now we get to why Descartes discovered transcendental phenomenology by finding the absolute, if you think of Descartes' project, it was to find the absolutely first truth. And finding something that is true, that turns out to be the most inner subjective certainty, which now becomes a model for all truth whatsoever. This is, if you like, a brilliant transcendental insight, according to Husserl. But Descartes himself immediately lost this transcendental insight when he treated the ego as a substance, a thinking substance. And he immediately, if you like, posits it as ein Endchen der Welt, a little tag end of the world, rather than seeing it as a condition for the possibility of world. Now, world itself is misunderstood in naturalism for all kinds of reasons, largely to do with that it thinks that the primary world is the world as picked out by physics. You can get that all the time, rather than recognizing, for example, that the world that's given to us is a world that is a communal world, that it has a collective social character to it. That again, naturalism for Husserl, and this is an important feature, misses this understanding of collective social world, the kind of stuff that John Searle talks about in his his way of understanding the constitution of the social world. That world is the world from which we primarily begin. And among the things that happen within that world is that there are scientists who have a view of nature and so on. So this is an important feature. And by the way, historically, in terms of the understanding of naturalism in Husserl's time, one of the interesting things about the naturalism debate as it took place in Germany in the 1920s, that a lot of it was not about physicalism, but was about the relationship between the natural sciences and the human sciences, and whether the human sciences can be brought within the scope of the natural sciences, or whether they have their own methodology, one that recognizes the peculiarities of the kinds of objects that social life presents before us. This is a quote has already been referred to by Dan Zahavi, is that naturalism, according to Husserl in the 1911 Philosophy is a Rigorous Science article, involves, if he says, the naturalization of consciousness. including all the intentionally immanent givens of consciousness, and on the other hand, the naturalization of ideas, and thus all ideals and norms. So the naturalization of normativity, if you like, and the ideal, and the naturalization of consciousness itself. These are the features of naturalism that we've already seen. Now, Husserl is not only thinks of naturalism as a cluster of ideas that have a particular historical shape and have evolved in a particular way, but he thinks that it misses what is essentially the full concrete experience that human beings have. A univocal determination of spirit through merely natural dependencies is unthinkable. We heard about these dependencies yesterday from Rudolf Bernet. As a reduction to something like physical nature, subjects cannot be dissolved into nature, for in that case what gives nature its very sense would be missing. So, I mean, this is, Husserl has a very strong view that naturalism, a kind of objectivism and physicalism, misses the very nature of subjectivity. And I mean, this gets to a point that Husserl's Transcendental Idealism claims that the very concept of a being in itself, or the world in itself, is the product of a very specific attitude, this attitude of trying to get objectivity as such. And Husserl thinks there was actually a breakthrough moment in Greek philosophy which led to science, when through the skeptics, the idea of what the world in itself was like, as opposed to what the world of our experience is like. There's the changing world of our experiences, and then somehow beyond that world there must be the way the world is in itself. But that very thinking of what a world in itself is like is a kind of a constituted insight, if you like, which we then use as, it's like a ruler, as a model for understanding our experience. But just like a ruler, it is a very specific measure that cannot be said to be what's really out there, in the sense of what we might think is what's really out there. What's really out there is the life world. And this is where Husserl makes the move, which I think is most interesting, is that his transcendental explanation of the origins of naturalism is, if you like, that naturalism involves a kind of rigidification of the natural attitude. And I think it's actually one of Husserl's discoveries, is this idea of the natural attitude. That human beings have a natural sense of things being there before they got here, and as having a certain temporal and spatial and physical character and independence from them. You know, the idea that my car is still there when I'm not thinking about it, and so on. This belongs to the natural attitude. And this natural attitude is, he thinks, deeply embedded in human beings. But it was changed by philosophy and science. Right? This attitude of original natural life. All other attitudes are accordingly related back to the natural attitude as reorientations of it. And that's an important point, that the scientific attitude, the scientific outlook, Weltauffassung, or however you want to think about it, is a particular, you can imagine as a kind of building built upon life in the natural attitude. The danger is if we replace the objects of the natural object with the scientifically constituted objects. This is a kind of category mistake for Husserl, and that's what naturalism does. Naturalism then is a product of the natural attitude, of our particular way of living in the world and thinking about it. So Husserl's view is that real science won't just rigidify the products of the science and replace the natural attitude with it, but real science will recognize how it has to, if you like, coexist with the real world of human beings. For example, Husserl talks about this often. On the one hand, science produces things like the Pythagorean theorem, that are truths that are identical across time. On the other hand, geometry is done by human beings who are finite and are carriers of this meaning. He talks about the role of writing and so on. But that the product of science is the product of human beings getting in various forms of social combination, and that it really is a view that science is right in terms of what it does, but always with regard to what are the restrictions of its method. But the life world is, if you like, for Husserl, the underlying focus of what phenomenology is to be about. And we come to recognize the life world and the natural attitudes when somehow we're able to break with it. It's through we have to be able to, in some sense, step outside of the natural attitude to recognize that it's running for us. You know? I think of it as being, it's like, Fink compares it to Plato's cave. You know, that we're in Plato's cave, that's the sort of natural attitude, and then people come back in and say, look, it's only shadows on the wall. And it takes a huge leap of reorientation of attitude to recognize that. So the transcendental project, if you like, is for us to recognize the always-on, flowing, natural attitude. And that the sciences are built on that natural attitude, and that the natural attitude view of time, space, causality, and so on carries over into the sciences. Right. Now, this is where Husserl himself gets, I think, into some difficulties. That he projects the possibility of a natural attitude reversal, so that we can enter into what he calls the transcendental attitude. And in The Crisis, he talks about this transcendental attitude as an attitude, if you like, above the pre-givenness of the validity of the world. He uses this word above the infinite complex, whereby in concealment the world's validities are always found in other validities and so on. We go above naturally absorbed life. And I think there is some danger for Husserl in thinking that it's possible for human beings to think of to take a stance on the natural attitude within which we are always, all the time, which is somehow free of that attitude, which brackets it, disrupts it, and allows us to focus on it. And this is where I think it gets more complex in Husserl. He thinks that I'll skip on here. When we arrive at this transcendental attitude, we now experience the world in a different way. So there is something which I think you don't find in Kant, the idea in Husserl of what he calls transcendental experience. Now the world reveals itself as a kind of set of subjective accomplishments of various kinds. Every existent of every kind becomes understandable as a product of transcendental subjectivity. I think of it naively as the difference between watching a movie and being completely absorbed in it, that's natural flowing life, and watching it as a student of movies and saying that was a long tracking shot that was done there, and look, he's changed the filter there, and the kind of things that a good film student can immediately see. While natural life is running on, you recognize how it's put together, how it's constituted. So for Husserl, this is the role of the transcendental attitude, is to live a new kind of hyper-reflexive life. So we're aware of the accretions or syntheses that we're performing, and of the manner in which we are understanding past and future. Husserl talks about this. I mean, obviously we have an individual sense of past and future, but he talks about how cultures have their own sense of their own past and their own projected sense of the future. So, you could become very aware of that, where you think you are in history, if you like. That is part of how you understand overall the flowing of history. Rorty talks about telling downbeat versus upbeat stories or whatever. You could have different approaches to your own flowing history. And so taking a certain stance on that allows you, if you like, it frees you from being trapped with it. For Husserl, this is all liberation. He wants to tell a new story, of the entire constitution of the world out of my own consciousness. Now we run into this problem, which I'll finish with, that part of my constitution, and this is for Husserl, if you like, his deepening of the Cartesian project. When I realize that it's me, it's I, that it's my consciousness that discloses the world to me, I can make a move in recognizing not just what my factual consciousness is, if you like, but to understand what a consciousness in general is, by thinking through some kind of modifications of my own experience, the notion of an ego in general, if you like. And through various kinds of modification, I can constitute what other egos are. Now, we got to this yesterday. There is a problem in Husserl as to whether, whether we really can, the sense in which we can understand the presence of other egos as being analogizations and modifications of my own egoic life. And Husserl, I think, gets blocked in his later work. He tries in the Cartesian Meditation in his later work to have a concept of the world as communally constituted by what he calls cooperating subjects together, by transcendental intersubjectivity. But right down at the heart of that intersubjectivity, he always seems to keep the ego, my ego, as being that which gives, if you like, recognition at very least to other egos, as having a role. Sartre talks about this quite well, as that, when you are in a park and you're the only one there, you're kind of experiencing, but then another arrives in, and then for Sartre that's like, as he puts it, a hole in being, that there's a meaning constituting source that I'm not in control of. And this is initially for Sartre a threat to me. But in Husserl, the presence of the other is not so much a threat like that, but we recognize that there is that the notion of an objective world is itself the idea of, well, anyone could see that. Not just me, but anyone in my place could see that. And so we move from my own egoic life, if you like, to the life of anyone. And that's as close as Husserl gets to the idea of the constitution, if you like, of objectivity. Let's look at it objectively means that I can get a point above my experience to recognize this is the way I experience things. This is my slant on the world. And get from there to something like there are slants on the world. And then there must be, if you like, slants on the world that others can also access, and therefore are not purely my subjective experience. It's not that I think Husserl thinks we get to a God's eye position that's above all stances or attitudes, but rather that we get at best the recognition that I can have attitudes, that others can have can somehow share my stance, or that I can alter my stance to that of the other, and that this mutual interpenetration of stances, if you like, this cooperation or triangulation of stances is what gives you objectivity, not there being a God's eye perspective that somehow mathematics or something gives us that tells us the way the world in itself is, that allows us to transcend our stance. So I mean, that's in brief, I think, I'm running out of time. In brief, I think that's what I've just outlined, if you like, what I take Husserl's transcendental idealism to be, and also why it can't be a naturalism of any kind. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dermot. We've got plenty of time for questions. Yes.
So I guess it's one issue of whether the naturalistic viewpoint can account for consciousness. Excuse me. And I'm kind of sympathetic to the view that it can't. But I'm still not feeling the pressure for why the naturalistic view can't account for the world outside of consciousness. I mean, your argument, as I've understood it, seems to be that the naturalistic way of thinking emerges from pre-existing ways of thinking. But it seems to me we can quite happily think that, but think that the naturalistic viewpoint is an improvement on our pre-existing ways of thinking, at least as regards getting at the world as it is in and of itself, which is obviously not always what we want to do. But so I'm just not feeling, but why can't we think, this mathematical physics emerges from our old ways of thinking about time, but it's better, at least when we're doing metaphysics.
Yeah, I think there are some problems there. I mean, there are various ones that come to mind. I mean, there is a kind of translation problem. That is, whether things that are called time within mathematical physics, how they're to be translated onto what we think of as time in our experience. And I think Husserl's view was that mathematical physics, and he was actually very good at that. He was a mathematician originally and very close to the leading mathematicians of his day. I think he thought that mathematics was such a specific formal method that its truths were of a formal kind. So that even something like mathematical physics, where you're talking about objects sliding down planes or whatever, you've reduced them to centers of gravity, or lines of force or vectors of force or whatever, and you have the truths that you discover are within that framework, and of course they're highly advanced and sophisticated and show us truths that are translatable into the everyday realm. So you can I'm not talking about. There's another thing that happens within the everyday realm, is that our life world now has things like electricity and light, electric light, and so on in it. Fridges, but we don't have to know how they work. So you know what I mean? Like we've integrated, if you like, the products of science without necessarily integrating the formal frameworks that gave rise. And I think the translation of the formal frameworks into the life world is actually very complicated. And Husserl warns about any straightforward replacement of life world ideas with scientific ones. So it's a more complex.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting complex question about translation, but still I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, well, I'm interested in the world as it is in and of itself outside of consciousness, and so I'm interested in that thing out there, whether it maps onto time as we understand it. I don't care. But anyway.
No, but I mean, you would say that, but you have to bear in mind that you're accessing it through mathematics and language and idealities that, in one sense or another, you and your culture have constructed.
So, follow-up question from David.
So suppose we agree that the world as articulated by science and the world as it appears to us are incommensurable, they can't collapse. But there's something else that you're giving us via Bristol, which is that in that case the world is lived as the real world and the scientific world is a construction. It's only hypothetical in one of the phrases we've not used yesterday. Why so? Where's the argument for that? I mean, why not suppose that there are two realities, and indeed that the lived world is part of the world? I mean, why think that the world is just the real world, a construction of our minds? That seems such a weird thing to think. I didn't see any argument for that.
I think that Husserl's view is that the natural attitude, if you like, gives us concepts like real. That the concept real and really there is a component part of the natural attitude. So of course, people in the natural attitude think that's the really real world, relative to the scientific world. But I think was your question that the transcendental idealist in the end says the scientific world is constituted, but the natural world we just think it's real. Is that?
No, I take it that from the transcendental idealist point of view, the real world is the lived world, the world of experience, and the world as described by science is hypothetical.
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about that. I think what he thinks is that the real world, the natural attitude has the lived world correlated to it, and the scientific world has the scientific world correlated to it. There is no world apart from some stance or attitude.
That's the bit.
That's the transcendental idealism, if you
Right,
like.
and that's the claim I see no argument for. That there's no world apart from worlds as experienced.
I think it goes to the very notion of what a world is. I mean, I think that we were saying a little bit about this. It's very complicated. Is that world is a set of horizons. I mean, when we're speaking English right now, I'm only drawing on certain words. But there is a background of the English language itself, and there are other words that are in the horizon that I could draw on in this. And I'm relying on you having a shared horizon with me in this regard. But those, if you could ask kind of where is the rest of the English language when we're using these words to each other? And I don't want to say it's just out there, right? That the words are just out there and I'm picking them, right? And I think that's the concept of horizon, that if we even start with some notion like that, we have to know that the notion of horizon isn't the kind of thing that's out there in the same sense as things. I had some quotes about that. So what a world is, you have to let go of what Putnam would call the ready-made world. I mean, Putnam was very influenced by Husserl's crisis on that very point, I think.
Okay, we've got about 5 or 6 questions. I'd like to take as many as possible, so if you keep them fairly short, that would be great. Yes?
Hi, Dermot.
He wants to come in on this. I think Rudolph wants to come in on this.
So, sorry, if you want to come in on the same topic, then.
Okay, you go. Thank you. Because I was in some agreement with what David just said. That has to do with a dispute among Husserlians. So the distinction between the Cartesian way, the transcendental reduction, and the way through the life worlds. So I don't think one does Husserl a favor to conflate the natural attitudes with naturalism. So I think, and then with the life worlds. So I think that Husserl's, especially in the crisis, now you have read or reread the crisis more recently than I do, but the way I think about it is that our natural attitude is naturalistic because so much influenced by science, and so there is a real need to rediscover the life worlds. And it's this rediscovery of the life worlds, which is a world of experience, we agree on that, that is a precondition for the step to transcendental phenomenology. So what is it that the life worlds has that the naturalistic and the natural attitude don't have? A certain awareness of the correlation. So the step out of the naturalistic attitudes to the rediscovery of the life worlds, which is described in Husserl in terms that are very similar to the existence of Dasein in Sein und Zeit. This is the decisive movement. And then the life world experience, its correlation, etc., etc., is in need of a further scientific explanation, which is what transcendental phenomenology provides. So I would insist on the fact that to some extent the life worlds, or the life in the life world, is something that has been covered up by naturalism, and therefore the life in the life worlds and our natural life are not the same.
I mean, there's a lot there that I would have to comment on, which would go beyond if we had time. But just very briefly, what I said was that for Husserl, naturalism is related to what he calls a naturalistic attitude, and he takes that to be, if you like, a rigidification of the natural attitude. We all have a natural attitude, but through a certain kind of taking of the scientific approach, some of us have sort of bought into, science tells us what's real. Sellers has various formulations of that, and I think I don't agree with you on one thing, and this is a matter of Husserl interpretation, that the Cartesian way and the way in through the life world, I've really come to the conclusion they're the same thing, actually. And you said I was conflating them, but I actually, I had a sort of moment of enlightenment when I realized that Husserl in The Crisis gives a long history of modern philosophy from Descartes through to Kant and Hegel. And in the Cartesian Meditations, he's just doing the Descartes bit. In other words, they're both historical, genetic ways of entering into the transcendental phenomenology. But that's a point really for Husserl scholarship.
I was really intrigued at the point in your talk where you said something like Rousseau gets into some trouble here.
Yeah.
Remember, it was about aboveness,
Yeah.
the possibility of the extent of aboveness.
Yes.
Right. And then you very quickly, this might maybe my interpretation, you very quickly pulled Rousseau back into relationality.
Yeah.
And I know that the Heidegger's break with Rousseau was very complex, but I wondered whether this was the point where Heidegger really got stuck in and said, this is the bit that I really want to disagree with.
Yeah.
And whether you think Heidegger misunderstood Rousseau, because you seem to understand Rousseau much more sympathetically in terms of relationality and the extent of aboveness. Just a few comments.
Right. I mean, there's a big issue in Husserl versus post-Husserlian phenomenology that tend to, Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty both sort of think of, as you call it, the sort of relationality or the multiple, the cooperating subjects of human beings together across history constitute, the historical, cultural world and the scientific world. I mean, that's the sort of line. There are times that Husserl sounds like, and he was criticized for having produced a kind of transcendental ego that was above all of that. That was a stance Wood could arrive at. That was, if you like, almost outside of the flow of history and time, and you could sort of get a stance that gave you an understanding of how these things were done. I think there are problems in Husserl's own account. I think that this is where the Cartesian element, he's really struck by the breakthrough to the recognition that he thinks he finds in Descartes, that the entire world can only be arrived at once we have an understanding of the cogito. And so that cogito is the building block for constituting the entire world. What happens, I think, is that this aboveness, I emphasize that because Husserl thinks that the transcendental attitude, if you like, is leads human beings to transcend. And Heidegger makes transcendence the very core of human existence. And so I think they're both trying to do this, the same thing here with that regard, but they interpret transcendence in different ways. One might say that being out there in the world already is much more Heideggerian than Husserlian. But that's a long story.
Okay, we'll take at least two more questions, Michelle and then Tom.
I was wondering about the notion of the objective that you were talking about towards the end. At one point you said that we constitute objectivity, and that sounds like there's some tension in there, because if we constitute it, then how is it objective exactly? Then you went on to say, oh well, it's that anyone could see it, right? Anyone could see this, and so then that sounds like you're going to say it's not dependent on any particular viewer, the way this object is, not dependent on any particular viewer, anyone can see it. But then it seems like a really short step to, it's not dependent, the way it is isn't dependent on anyone seeing it. And so you just remove the constitution element completely, and then you get this notion of
Then you get pure objectivity.
Yeah. So it sounds like maybe he's on the way to saying that.
I don't think so. I think he thinks that people make that move.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in the notion of objectivity, I like to think of it in terms of not, if you like, measurement of something against a criterion that's sort of independent and standing, standing there, like, is my meter as long as the one in Paris, that kind of thing. But I was thinking of this in terms of the way people decide what happened in a trial. You take different witnesses and you hear different accounts, and you put yourself in the mind of the person, and you think, well, if I was there, would I think that's reasonable, and so on. And you're constituting, if you're supposing it's inquiry into a traffic accident, you're trying to constitute what happened. But what happened is in the past and gone. There is no object now that we can compare our accounts to. But we have standards of what we take to be the most objective assessment we have of the situation through some kind of cooperating and triangulating between people. And with a sense of people saying, no matter what I think about the situation, if I put my own views aside, I can imagine what anyone would feel like in that situation, something like that. So it's out of those kinds of activities that objectivity is produced. But of course, the pretense, if you like, even in the jury, is that the judge and the jury can put aside all their personal lives and personal understandings and just think of it objectively. And so we have that. That's our kind of gold standard of objectivity. But what the actual much messier business of how we arrive at it by co-constituting it is something along the lines of what Husserl will be describing.
Tom?
I think my question was so close to Michelle's, I'll stop there.
Okay, well, we can take one more then. You had a question.
Oh, really? I think the key issue here, Dermot, I think you might agree with me, is the notion of the world. I think that's what you bring up. I just think that there'd be a real confusion if one talks about the world of science and the world that you're talking about as somehow being comparable. And one could say one is true or not, and the other argue about that. But I think the position is the science has no world. There isn't a world of science in the sense distinct from the world you're talking about, because science treats objects. So it views about things and describes things, but it doesn't describe a world. And I would say, well, in one sense, especially if you think about, as a crisis goes on into the first division of being in time, the key issue is what we mean by a world, and why it's very peculiar to think of a world as some kind of thing in which things are in. And so I don't think we should ever get in the position of, is science telling us the truth about the world? Because I don't think science in any way is talking about the world in that sense. And I would say in the end, although one would have to be a bit more complex than I can say in a few seconds, is that in the end science is something that human beings do. In that sense one can talk about a scientific world.
Yeah.
But that world isn't something that can be treated as a scientific object.
I think that's articulating a view that's close to us. I think Husserl is slightly different to that, because he doesn't want to just resolve science into a set of human practices. There was a breakthrough moment in Western history with philosophy and science that produced the concept of the world in itself. So that is actually a kind of discovery of our, Western scientific tradition. But it is a very special kind of ideal. And in the rest of what you're saying, it's not a world in the sense of this world. I mean, the world, I didn't say any of this, but the natural world we live in is for Husserl always the personal world, the interpersonal world. That's the primary experience world. And if you even think of it, I mean, I gave an example a minute ago of the jury, but I was just talking to somebody yesterday about the refereeing process, which is at the very center of science. That in a way objective truth, or what stands as truth, is determined by a kind of refereeing process, which is, replete with all of the complexities of the life world. Human beings exercising their judgments about what they take other human beings to be doing, and whether it's well done and badly done and so on. All of the other factors that go into play there, and that that's in a way that's the real world of science. You know, what people are actually doing on a day-to-day basis. But the substruct, or the intellectual framework that emerges out of that, and what we've left all out of completely, is Husserl and Heidegger, a very complex account of how that framework gets applied as technology in the world. That is a really powerful, transformative force. So it's not just sets of practices. It has, if you like, a kind of projection into the life world, which is transformative and indeed threatening to the life world ultimately for Husserl. But at the same time, the crisis of the European sciences, that's why there's a crisis, that we have to figure out how can we have these sciences and continue the value-laden world that we want to live in. So that's the message.
Okay, well, can we thank Dermot again and then continue?